Hello, I'm Randy Seaver. I'd like to talk to you today about a video that I recently viewed by Leighton. The video was titled, "Did John Piper Recant Calvinism?" Apparently one of Mr. Flowers' followers had sent him a video of a question and answer period in which John Piper was answering a question about generational sins and whether we are held guilty for those sins of our parents, or are we simply held guilty for our personal sins? And John Piper was rightly explaining that, yes, we are affected by the sins of our parents because we follow their example, and we sometimes develop the same patterns of behavior that our parents had followed, and consequently we commit the same sins they committed, and so their sins are visited on us in that way. Now, being the good ex-Calvinist that he claims to be, Mr. Flowers then jumped to a totally different subject and began to explain that John Piper was really contradicting himself in another message that Piper was preaching, because Mr. Piper was talking about the imputation of Adam's sin, and that we are held guilty because of what Adam did. And there was a complete confusion of these two completely separate topics. No Calvinist believes, at least no Calvinist that I've ever been acquainted with, believes that our parents or our grandparents have been divinely constituted as representative heads of the entire race. Nor do we believe that they have been divinely constituted as our representative heads so that their sin becomes our sin, that is, imputed to us so that we bear the consequences of what they have done. We bear our own burden, and that's what we consistently believe. The other subject has to do with the imputation of Adam's sin, and the fact that we, in Adam, fell and are therefore condemned because of what he did. Not only have we received his nature, but we have also received his guilt. And I want to spend some time talking about that from Romans chapter 5, in verses 12 through 19, perhaps on a separate video, because I may not be able to finish all the material here. Toward the end of that presentation, Mr. Flowers made this astounding statement. He said this: "We know intuitively that God would not hold us guilty for something we didn't do. Instead, he holds us guilty simply because of what we do in our personal transgressions." And he said that we know this intuitively because we know that God is fair. We know that God is just. And so it just makes sense, said Mr. Flowers. And that was the sum and substance of his theological argumentation. He did not offer a shred of hermeneutical background, that is, interpretational background for what he was saying. That is, he did not talk about the context whatsoever. He did not talk about Paul's purpose for writing. He didn't talk about the structure of the passage at all. He didn't talk about the implications of what he was saying. He simply said, we know that this must be the way it is. We know this intuitively because God is fair. Now, keep in mind that Mr. Flowers is not using any sort of objective standard to determine whether or not God is fair. He is imposing his own standard of fairness on God and determining that God could not have done what he doesn't think God would have been fair in doing. Now, such deep theological reasoning is difficult to argue against. The staggering thing is that this man has a large number of followers who swallow everything he has to say hook, line, and sinker, and don't ever think through the implications. But the implications are grave. The implications are serious. even affecting the message of the gospel that we preach. If what Paul was writing in Romans chapter 5 does not mean that Adam's sin has been imputed to all his posterity, then we have a huge problem with Paul's doctrine of justification by faith through the imputation of Christ's righteousness alone. And we're going to see that a little bit later on as we make our way through Romans chapter 5. But in reality, if you don't understand the whole idea of representative headship, you're not going to understand the New Testament scriptures, and you're not going to understand the doctrine of union with Christ, because those two things go together, and we need to understand that those two things go together. Now, let me come back for a moment to Mr. Flowers' allegation that it just wouldn't be fair if God imputed Adam's transgression to us. It would be so much more fair if we could stand for ourselves and act for ourselves and ourselves alone. Interestingly, I read a statement that I'm assuming that Mr. Flowers has signed, since he is part of the traditionalist movement in the Southern Baptist Convention. They've written a whole series of articles of affirmation and denial, and ostensibly these articles of affirmation and denial are against the Calvinists in the Southern Baptist Convention. I may do a video or two just on these affirmations and denials and show that many of the statements they affirm, we Calvinists would also affirm along with them. However, there are some statements they make that would, I think, border on heresy. But let me just read for you the second article titled The Sinfulness of Man, in which they have said this: we affirm that because of the fall of Adam, every person inherits a nature and environment inclined towards sin, and that every person who is capable of moral action will sin. Now listen to that very carefully. We believe that because of the fall of Adam, every person inherits a nature. Mr. Flowers says he's not so sure about that term nature, but every person inherits a nature and environment inclined towards sin, and that every person who is capable of moral action will sin. And Mr. Flowers says that's better than to have been represented by Adam, so that Adam's transgression is imputed to us. Now, I want you to think about that just a little bit, because it seems to me that we would be far better represented by someone who was created in the image of God, someone who is inclined toward holiness, placed in a perfect environment with only one object of temptation, than we would be to represent ourselves in a fallen environment with a nature that is inclined towards sin, an environment that has been ruined and surrounded by temptation on every hand, with the absolute certainty that every person who is capable of moral action will actually sin. In other words, our failure is determined, according to this statement, our failure is determined by the nature we have been given. It is absolutely certain that we're going to sin. Now, one of the questions I asked Mr. Flowers some time ago, to which I've not received an answer as yet, because they're later going to say that we deny, in the same statement, this same article, we deny that Adam's sin resulted in the incapacitation of any person's free will. And so my question was this: if every person has a libertarian free will, how is it certain that every person who is capable of moral action will sin? Could they not, with their free will decision, decide, I'm simply not going to sin. I'm going to stand upright. No problem. But according to this statement, failure is absolutely certain for everyone who is capable of moral action. Now, I understand that they are probably trying to deal with the whole problem of infant salvation. And so if they can make this statement, then they can demonstrate that infants who die in infancy are necessarily saved because they have not been confronted with a moral question, a moral choice, and have not sinned personally, and therefore they are free from condemnation. And we're going to see that that's precisely the opposite of what Paul teaches in Romans chapter 5 in our next video. And so here's my question. Which is better, to be represented by someone who is inclined toward righteousness, placed in a perfect environment with everything that he needed to satisfy him, inclined toward holiness, and with only one object of temptation? Or is it better for me to represent myself in my fallen condition, inclined toward sin, in an environment that is corrupted, surrounded by temptation, with the absolute certainty that when I am confronted with temptation, with a moral decision, I am certain to sin? Which of those is better? Mr. Flower seems to like analogies, so let's see how he likes this analogy. It seems to me that this is very much like 4 or 5 young men who are slight of stature. Perhaps they're 5'2", 5'3", and they have minimal ability to play basketball, going to try out for the basketball team. And because, quote, the coach didn't like them, they didn't make the team. Instead, the coach chose 5 men to be on the first string, and several others who had a little bit lesser ability, but they were also chosen to be on the team. And these 5 people were chosen to represent the entire school. Each one of them measured 6'4". They almost never, ever missed a shot. And so they were chosen to represent the entire school. Interestingly, if they won, everyone in the school would be able to say, "We won." If they lost, everyone in the school would probably say, "They lost." Suppose one of those young men, 5'2", 5'3", no ability, said to someone after the game was over, "You see, they should have chosen me. If I had been there, if I could have represented the school, I would have done better than they did." Now, does that make any sense at all? And the answer is, of course not. You'd be far better off represented by 5 guys who were 6'4" and had great ability than you would be by a guy who's 5'2" and has little ability at all. And you see, that's what this statement is saying. This statement is saying it's better for us to act for ourselves in a state of incapacitation, spiritually speaking, in an environment that has been ruined, surrounded by temptation, with the absolute certainty that we are going to fail when confronted with moral choices, than it would be for us to have been represented by the one that God chose to represent us. That, my friends, is lunacy. Now, I'd like to talk to you because I don't want to just talk about analogy. I do want to give you an analogy next time about a guy who has been accused of committing a crime, representing himself in court. I'll try to remember to do that. Next time, I want to spend some time talking about Romans chapter 5, because our understanding of Romans chapter 5 is essential to our understanding of the gospel. But until then, I wish you the very best, and I'll look forward to spending time with you in the next video. May God richly bless you.